So on Wednesday, our young classroom, for the first time in 17 months, he was a sophomore when he last attended school on his campus. He's a senior now. He has a driver's license and he has a list of colleges that he's considering applying for. This isn't a normal start to the school year at all. You see, this month, all around us, children and teens are having this very same experience. These kids, they are not the same people that they were when they packed up their belongings. What everyone just sort of thought was going to be a couple weeks of closure. They thought it was just going to be this little blip, and certainly not the great gaping chasm that it has turned out to be. 17 months. That's enough time to go from only just entering your teens to becoming an incipient adult. For younger children, well, it can just span several different developmental stages. There's kids out there who left kindergarten wiggly and rolling around on all of those rugs and pillows. And now all of a sudden they return to find themselves seated in rows of desks in the second grade. There's tweens who were looking forward to middle school, and now they're entering this new to them building halfway through their years in that building. And yet they still haven't even had a chance to figure out that seminal rite of passage, how to get from period 1 to period 2 to period 3, right? Now, I know that we have all been impacted by the experience of COVID. But the time away from what should have been was a metamorphic one for children and for teens. For us adults to pretend otherwise, well, that would just be naive of us. I mean, I can only imagine the awkward social interactions that are taking place in classrooms and hallways as students try to figure out who they are and where they fit pretty much from scratch. Now, I sat down this week, as I always do in August, to transfer all of those important dates from the school to family calendar. The last one that I wrote down was our son's graduation date in June. Now, as I typed and I clicked away, I realized that there isn't any kind of event or recognition to mark this month's monumental shift in our kids' lives. You see, we just expected them to return to normal, as if that's something that they even remember, much less know how to use that word to describe what they're experiencing during these first few days that have taken place this past week. I think the schools might have forgotten something. Maybe they actually need to be holding commencement ceremonies right now. And by commencement, well, I mean in the ordinary sense of that word. I mean ceremonies to mark the beginning of something completely new. Now, if we had commencement ceremonies this week, they would be a ceremony of renewal. It would be an opportunity for young people to recommit to things like, well, waking up, putting on actual clothes instead of whichever pair of pajama bottoms they want to hang out in for the day. Commit to walking through their front doors and putting themselves out there among their community of peers, even if they kind of look and feel like they have become different people. Sure, Now, a ceremony like this would have all of those motivating speeches from principals and teachers. There would also need to be a chance for the kids to say, I'm in too. So, what do you think? Good idea? I think so. Of course, the best thing about this kind of commencement is that there are absolutely no requirements for being there. I mean, they didn't even have to pass online school to get to this day. In fact, the truth is that many of them struggled to learn anything at all over the last 17 months. We would need to acknowledge all of this, the change, the loss, and most especially the mere accomplishment of just making it to the other side of this 17 months. First, there would need to be a promise from everyone to make this go at learning better than the last. Unlike graduation, there are no requirements for a renewal. All you have to do is show up with an open heart and a willingness to participate fully. That's a moment worthy of public celebration. We just have to figure out how to do it. Well, King Solomon, he certainly knows how to throw a giant public celebration of reaffirmation. Yeah, I know that they did this under King David. If we were here in July, you would have heard that description of that recommitment ceremony with their covenant with God when they first brought the ark into Jerusalem and David put it inside of a tent. But you know what? It's been a while. They have a new king, King Solomon, and that king, in fact, wasn't even born yet when David held that ceremony many, many, many years before. So much has taken place in the lives of God's people. Good stuff, bad stuff, things that are worthy of celebration, and things that are worthy of lament. In fact, they're literally a whole new generation. They're standing before God and they are offering of themselves and their lives to this special covenant relationship. They're doing it just like their parents and their grandparents before them, but they're also doing it in a completely new way. You see, this generation has built a permanent home for God. They have this shiny new golden temple. It's made of stone and cedar, and they filled it with altars and giant statues of cherubim. They have spent years, and God only knows how much treasure, building this amazing temple. Now, it is nothing like the canvas pavilion that David erected inside his city walls to house the Ark of the Covenant. Our lectionary skips the details, but you can read a description of it in the Bible. Or you can just Google Solomon's Temple, and you can find all sorts of artists' rendering of what they think it might have looked at like based on those descriptions. In fact, I even found one really cool like 3D video tour of going in all of the different spaces. It's pretty cool. I recommend you check it out. So here they are. They are ready to dedicate their work and also to rededicate themselves. They want to rededicate all of it to God. They invite God in. In fact, they march God's throne right in through the front door. And boy, does God ever show up. One might even say that God's presence, well, it just kind of overwhelms this admittedly massive structure and spills right out of the Holy of Holies. In fact, it's doing it in a way that pretty much has the priests freaked out. I mean, everyone remember that pillar of smoke that used to lead them across the desert back during the Exodus? Well, it is clearly more than human walls can contain. So, of course, then there comes the speeches. Oh God, there is no God like you. We walk before you with all of our hearts. Look, we built this house for you, God. And today we promise anew to follow in your ways, just like our ancestors did. Solomon is pretty much on a roll. His energy is building with every new word that he proclaims to the people. I like to imagine that the crowd is really into it too, offering hearty amens and hallelujahs after each of Solomon's declarations. That's the next part where it starts to get really good. Solomon, he's getting so into it that I wonder if he's still thinking about what he's actually saying. Because the next thing is, even the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I've built. It's like he just sort of lets that slip. And in a way, Solomon is suggesting that they didn't actually need to do it at all to build that huge building in order to meet God. Now, that's kind of risky given all of the slave hours and taxes that have gone into that temple. But it's also kind of humble because Solomon is genuinely admitting that there is no way that even all of his power and his wealth can entice God to limit the reach of God's love. It's an acknowledgement. It's an acknowledgement that, in fact, they didn't need to do anything, and God would still be right there with them, reaching out and offering to teach them how to keep walking in God's ways of love. In fact, Solomon keeps on going and says, God's not just there for them. God there, in fact, for everyone. All the peoples of the earth, he declares. He says foreigners, well, they might know God too. And that's a pretty big statement given the mainstream worldview of much of the Torah. What Solomon's doing is also this honest declaration that humans, even though we know that God is everywhere and with everyone and in every place, well, we also still need ways to make our connection with God just feel more concrete. We need those special places and practices and rituals. We need these kinds of ways to renew and remind us of God's presence and action in our lives and in the world around us. So here goes Solomon, one last piece. Please, God, let us know that you are listening to us so that when we come to this temple to ask you for help, we will know that you hear us. From here, you can imagine the entire crowd just sort of breaking out into song. It's probably something like one of the Psalms. Maybe that psalm that we read today. O Lord of hosts, happy are they who put their trust in you. What's wonderful about today's psalm is that it describes not just the peak experience of this kind of renewal, it describes this kind of lifelong pilgrimage with God. It's a pilgrimage that will involve more heights, but also those depths and the springs of renewal that follow each and every one of them. I love that word dwell. It has this sort of constancy that means that God remains despite all of the vicissitudes of our spiritual journeys. This description tells us of an amazing moment, a moment of public reaffirmation of promises that were made long ago. Everyone is dancing and praying and feeling truly reconnected to God and to each other. They're ready to move forward together again as God's covenant people. But what about those times when, well, we aren't sure where God is or how we fit into God's plan of love and transformation for humanity? I think that maybe those Christians in Ephesus were feeling this. We learn about it in reading. I can tell because of all of that really dark us and them imagery that Paul uses today. Yep, people. We did it then, and we do it now. We get this kind of bunker mentality. And this passage that we heard today, it has been misused. It has been misused a lot across all of history to feed that notion that non-Christians are somehow a threat. It has been used to validate supposedly holy wars and pogroms. Now, the Jesus that you and I know, well, that Jesus would never let a perception of present darkness justify those kinds of violence or oppression, and neither should we. Instead, Jesus's way is to bring light and life even to the darkest of places. The other thing is that we need to read this letter from Paul to his church in Ephesus in context. Paul's readers lived in a city that was the cultic center of the Roman Empire. Ephesus was full of monumental expressions of religious fervor. Things like a huge, giant temple to the goddess Artemis. I mean, you can still see it today. If you go to Google Earth, you can scan down, see those pillars. They've survived through millennium. It was also a time when they had just constructed a new temple so that they could worship the Emperor Domitian as the divine one. So you can imagine that this growing community of Christian converts in Ephesus was subject to suspicion, probably even harassment and discrimination. There was even said to be a riot by the idol makers targeted at that particular Christian community. You can read about it in the Acts of the Apostles. Yet, as we look at the text, you can also see how Paul is using the language of these people's experience to get beneath that sense of abandonment and to point them back towards all the ways that Jesus is right there with them through everything that they're facing. Be strong in the Lord and put on the whole armor of God. This is Paul's call for a spiritual renewal among their community. Paul's using some very creative, concrete imagery. He's using it to remind them that God is always right there, protecting them in front, behind, side, just right there surrounding them. Paul's program for renewal is centered on prayer, and more prayer. Talk to God. It's like Paul's practically screaming it off the page. Talk to God, and you won't forget that God is with you no matter what. So Jesus's disciples, well, they're also portrayed in our reading today as feeling uncertain about how they fit with God's plan of love and transformation for all of humanity. In fact, today we read that a few of them actually gave up and left. The text, it out and out admits that Jesus's teaching is too challenging for some. This teaching, it's difficult. Who can accept it, they complain, as they just kind of walk right on back to whichever village they came from. So the disciples that stay, they're modeling a kind of faith that accepts that wrestling with our belief is just as much a part of our walk with Jesus as the moments when we feel a sense of certainty. Those 12 has accepted that Jesus' teaching, well, it is worth all of that wrestling. As long as they stay with Jesus, for every confusion and uncertainty, there will be another epiphany of understanding. Lord, they say, to whom can we go? It's you who has the words of eternal life. And so at the end of today's reading, we hear them recommitting. They are recommitting to Jesus by affirming out loud something that they'd started to realize in their hearts every time they saw Jesus challenging them with word or amazing deed. They witnessed all that stuff. It came to form in their hearts, and now they know and they can say it out loud. Jesus, you are the Holy One of God. So, us, what kind of renewal do we need right now? Undoubtedly, COVID has changed our faith, and it has definitely changed us. We may have grown in our faith, we may have struggled in our faith. In fact, we could have done both. In either case, COVID has caused us to wrestle, maybe even consider walking away from God and from our community of faith. I mean, we saw each other less. We fell out of the habit of walking between those two glass doors to worship God, sitting side by side in the same room. But God has an invitation of grace for each and every one of us. There's no requirements for this kind of renewal. We're all new people. And this is an invitation to come as we are now, to find our places again, because everyone around us is doing the same thing. We can spend some time with God. We can spend some time with our fellow travelers. We get to remember things and the people that brought us to God to begin with. And we get to wrestle with all of the questions and the changes that this season of COVID, this 17 months, has brought for all of us. And ultimately, we'll discover new ways that God's love is working in each one of us and all around us. So I have an invitation for you too. My invitation is that you join with us for these next 28 days. And then if you choose to stand up with us on September 19th. That's the day when we'll have our public celebration of reaffirmation, reaffirming that we are recommitting to God anew as the new people that we've become. We're going to reaffirm our faith in God, working in Jesus through the Holy Spirit, a God that has been here with us and will continue to be here with us. And we will recommit to discovering together what God is calling us into as this community of faith. So it's true, humans, well, we need those ways to make our connection with God feel more concrete. We need special places, we need special practices, and we need rituals of renewal to remind us of God's presence and God's action in our lives and in our world, even as it and we are changing all the time. Now, it would be a ceremony of renewal, an opportunity for all of us to recommit to things like, well, waking up, putting on actual clothes, and walking out through our own front doors and opening up ourselves right here among our family of faith, even if we look different and even if we feel like a different people. I promise you, there will be a really good sermon from the bishop, and there will also be a chance for each and every one of us to say, I'm in it too. So, what do you think?